Years at the intersection of innovation. More information at nnmd.org.
Katie Freeway headed in on 10 around Eldridge, Dairy, Ashford area. Get reports of an accident involving a motorcycle. They could be blocking some lanes to work on that. Weather sponsored by Stewart PC, attorneysforexecutives.com. 91 for the high today. Warm conditions, sunshine 74 for the low tonight. Could see some wind gust of 28 miles an hour or so. 90 again tomorrow. 30% chance of some showers. More rain Thursday. Cooling off going in to Friday and Saturday. We're at 77 right now. It's KUHF Houston News 88.7, a service of the University of Houston. Streaming live online at houstonpublicmedia.org, on our app as well. News updated 24/7. It's 9 o'clock. Good morning.
Houstonians' optimism about job opportunities has dropped more drastically in the last year than in any year since the oil bust of the 1980s. I'm Craig Cohen. Today on Houston Matters, that and other findings from the latest Kinder Houston area survey released Monday. We discuss why Houstonians are feeling more economic pressure and how it's not just those with lower incomes.
Houston Matters with Craig Cohen is a production of Houston Public Media with support from Baylor College of Medicine.
Also this hour, the state of Texas is all in on the development of data centers, but just how much electricity will they demand from the power grid, and what does it mean for the rest of us? We'll discuss. Then navigating the new and complicated world of pay for college athletes. And violinist Joshua Bell discusses a work he commissioned a few years ago, which he'll perform early next month with the Houston Symphony. We'll start with the news update from NPR and News 88.7. Stay with us.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. President Trump claims Iran has informed the White House that Iran is in a, quote, state of collapse. Writing online last hour, Trump says that Iran wants the U.S. to open the Strait of Hormuz, while Iran tries to figure out its leadership situation. Trump says he believes Iran can do this. He offered no evidence to support his claim. Trump's comments come as he and his security team reviewed an Iranian plan to end the war. It calls for the Strait of Hormuz to open and for the U.S. to drop its naval blockade. But the plan puts talks on nuclear negotiations on hold for later. The United Arab Emirates says it is planning to leave the world oil cartel, OPEC, by next month, and the UAE says it will gradually boost oil production. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the move comes as crude oil prices are just under $100 a barrel.
The UAE's desire to increase oil production has been a source of friction within OPEC. The cartel often limits how much its members can pump in an effort to maintain a floor under crude oil prices. Those prices have spiked as a result of the U.S. war with Iran, which has stalled tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. AAA says the average price of regular gasoline now tops $4.17 a gallon. That's up 15 cents in the last week and more than $1 higher than this time last year. Rising gas prices are tough on consumers, but good for energy companies. BP says its first quarter profits were more than double what it earned in the same period last year. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
This is the second day of Britain's King Charles's state visit to the U.S. to honor the country's 250th birthday. The king will address a joint meeting of Congress this afternoon. He and Queen Camilla met President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump at the White House yesterday. Trump will hold a state dinner for them tonight. Hundreds of employees at Google say they are concerned about how the Pentagon might use its powerful artificial intelligence systems. NPR's Bobby Allen reports they've sent a letter to the company's chief executive.
More than 600 Google employees wrote to CEO Sundar Pichai that, quote, "We want to see AI benefit humanity, not see it being used in inhumane or extremely harmful ways." The demand comes as Pentagon leaders have pressed tech companies to harness AI for all lawful uses, a category Google workers fear will mean its tools will be deployed for autonomous weapons and mass surveillance. Anthropic, the maker of Claude, has been locked in a legal standoff with the Trump administration over the company's refusal to give defense officials access to its technology without guardrails. The Google letter urges the company to reject any contracts that involve classified work, which the employees say could violate human rights. Google and the Pentagon did not return requests for comment. Bobby Allen, NPR News.
Google is a financial supporter of NPR. You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Lilly Endowment, a private foundation supporting NPR's coverage of religion and spirituality. And Jarl and Pamela Mohn, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts.
Live from News 88.7 in Houston, I'm Matt Harab. The Harris County District Attorney's Office is reviewing cases involving a former Houston police officer seen in a video making racist comments about black people. That video, containing comments from former Officer Ashley Gonzalez, has been widely circulated online. In a statement to Houston Public Media, the District Attorney's Office says that they have begun, quote, the thorough analytical process of reviewing every case involving Gonzalez, unquote. She was fired from HPD last Friday. The review of her cases comes after 2 Houston City Council members called for it. Houston Mayor John Whitmire faces formal ethics complaints over his new podcast. As we first reported, it cost up to $60,000 in taxpayer funds. Our Dominic Anthony Walsh reports Whitmire is accused of illegal political advertising.
On the first episode of the podcast, Whitmire alluded to next year's municipal election, in which he plans to run.
We can't be using taxpayer funds for an elected official to be pontificating or talking about is there future elections.
Houston Progressive Caucus co-chair Audrey Nath argues the comment runs afoul of state law, prohibiting public dollars being used on political advertising.
He should reimburse the people of Houston, pay back the $60K from his own campaign funds.
The caucus filed the complaints with local and state authorities over the past week. It is not the first clash between the group and Whitmire. In December, the caucus led the successful push for the Harris County Democratic Party to admonish Whitmire and withhold future endorsements. I'm Dominic Anthony Walsh, News 88.7.
In a statement, the mayor's office says, quote, the podcast will be informative and feature guests beyond the mayor, but will not feature any campaign content for measures or candidates. And the deadline to apply for property tax exemptions in Harris County is this Thursday. That means this is the last week for homeowners to try to cut down on their property taxes through optional homestead exemptions. The county recently launched a web page that has tools to help folks navigate the process, and that is located on the Appraisal District's website. I'm Matt Harab, News 88.7.
This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. Good morning. Thanks for joining us here on News 88.7 and Houston Public Media's YouTube channel. Coming up this hour, the state of Texas is all in on the development of data centers. But just how much electricity will they demand from the power grid, and what does it mean for the rest of us? We'll discuss. Also navigating the new and complicated world of pay for college athletes. First, though, Greater Houston has long been seen as a bellwether for where America is heading, and the 45th annual Kinder Houston Area Survey released Monday by Rice University's Kinder Institute for Urban Research suggests that the region may be at a crossroads. Economic pressures are intensifying. Job optimism has dropped more drastically than in any year since the 1980s, back when there was an oil bust, of course. And financial anxiety seems to be spreading across every income level. Dan Potter is director of the Houston Population Research Center at the Kinder Institute. He's with us now. Dan, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
All right. So this survey is the nation's longest running study of its kind of any metro area's economy, population, life experiences, beliefs, and attitudes. And while it has changed in some ways over the years, you do make a point of asking some of the same questions every year. That, I think, gives as close to an apples-to-apples comparison as we could probably ever get when it comes to this kind of research. So let's start there. You always ask what, for instance, respondents to your survey say is the area's biggest problem. What did they say this year?
The economy. That, to your point, we've asked this question year over year, and while the economy has definitely been one of the top concerns in years past, this year, it just excelled above the others, with 1 in 4 residents lifting it up as the area's biggest problem. And that wasn't just a Harris County thing. That was true for all 3 counties that are included in this study, which is Fort Bend, Harris, as well as Montgomery.
Yeah, we've had you and your predecessor in every year that this survey has been released since 2013. And there are certain trends that seem to develop in those years when there is a general sense that the economy is moving along steadily. Things like traffic bubble up to the top as the greatest concern. Some years crime is at the top. Yep. But when it is the economy, when it is jobs or the sense of job security, when that bubbles up, we kind of take notice because it does seem to be more of an exception than the rule.
It absolutely does. Over the last several years, when we've been asking folks to reflect on the job opportunities in the Houston area, we're typically getting anywhere between 60, 65, 70% of people saying that the job opportunities here are good or excellent. And then this year, we saw that 29 percentage point decrease down to about 41%. And that is, as you mentioned, the lowest single-year drop we've seen since the oil crisis in Harris County, the largest we have ever detected in Fort Bend and Montgomery. And it is at some of the lowest levels we've seen since the Great Recession. And one of the things that's a big question mark for us is there's no precipitating event here, the way that you could look at the oil crisis, you could look at the Great Recession. And so what is driving those sentiments? And those sentiments aren't just sort of based in this belief system. The Houston area was anticipated to add 70,000 jobs in 2025. It added less than 20,000 jobs. And so, that's not just a perception. It's this feeling that is premised in reality.
More than 1 in 5 respondents say they are worse off financially than they were a year ago. You're seeing the share of people who say they're just getting by or finding it difficult to get by is rising across all income groups. What does it say to you that middle-income families are using language that used to be associated only with those in or near poverty?
Yeah, a lot of times when we talk about some of those economic challenges, for some folks, they'll sort of go, oh, yes, we understand folks making less than a certain amount. But this year, to your point, we were seeing across that economic spectrum, whether I was making $150,000 or $15,000, I was telling you, us in the sense of the survey respondents there, we are feeling constrained, and it's coming back to the prices at the grocery store. It's the cost of gas at the pump. It is those rents continuing to add. It's also the insurance and the taxes that are catching up with people. Folks are just feeling it from all these different angles, and I think one of the things that seems to be concentrated in some of the responses we heard this year is there doesn't feel like there's this relief on the horizon. There's not this sentiment of we're about to turn a corner. It's the sort of, ooh, we are stuck in something right now. And so how do we get out of this?
What did respondents tell you about the ability to cover unexpected expenses?
Yeah, that's our $400 question, as we referred to it. And we've asked folks that for now several years. If you had a $400 unexpected expense, would you just pay for it with money you have? Would you have to borrow that money to pay for it? Or would you simply be unable to cover that expense? And especially among lower and middle income earners here, that is where we did see an incredible uptick for some of them. Again, just saying that $400 unexpected expense is just too much for them financially right now. And again, for $400, you're talking about a check engine light, a sick kid, a flat tire, HVAC unit needs to get tuned up for the upcoming summer. All of a sudden, those funds are just gone. And so there's a lot of people sitting there on that financial edge right now.
You mentioned groceries, and you mentioned gas prices, and you mentioned insurance, and there are a number of different things that people might point to. Did you drill down into what specific expenses may be behind this pressure? What bills people are saying they're getting that are giving them this sticker shock?
Yeah, so when people are talking to us about what they view as the biggest problem, they are filling in some details for us there. And so it really is boiling down to those day-to-day expenses, just not being able to get ahead. And so we heard groceries several times. We heard about taxes. We heard about insurances, as well as just general cost of gas and transportation. We do typically categorize cost of housing as something separate than the sort of general cost of living. But inflation was something that got brought up. Again, it was the sentiment that I'm working, I have a job, I'm making money. My paycheck is just not covering my life from paycheck to paycheck. And we're not talking about exuberant lifestyles, right? We're just talking about the basics that folks are really struggling.
Well, is some of that also how do people define what are the basics, and has that changed at all?
So we've not seen anything to suggest that people are thinking differently about how they're spending their funds. Again, we're talking about typical grocery shopping. We're talking about that property insurance. We're talking about car insurance, as well as any sort of property taxes that are coming along for homeowners as being the things that are getting in people's way of feeling financially secure. And we have an additional study coming up that looks in particular about housing costs that people are experiencing and where affordability pressures are. And utility bills were one of the big things that popped up there. And so, again, sort of getting these signals from a couple of different places. It's not a single source that seems to be the sore spot for people. It's this from all these different angles feeling that pressure on their finances.
We have a comment from Brandon on who's watching on our YouTube channel. Says it's like we're in this endless feedback loop where Houston gets new pushes of commerce and capital, but then there's like a new wave of obstacles that come in the way.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of folks, again, part of it is how do we figure out ways of helping to make sure that as the Houston area continues to be a prosperous area, we get more folks involved in that and we're not having people feeling they're having to run the rat race every day.
This year's survey shows strong social connections can have an impact on respondents' sense of well-being, maybe even more than income. What exactly do the numbers show about that?
Yeah, so one of the things we were trying to be responding to with this year's survey was the fact that right now we are experiencing very high levels of social divisiveness. That's research from all around the country is pointing to this, and higher levels than what we've seen in the last 30 to 40 years. And I mean, in some ways, you almost don't have to research it. You can just live it in your day-to-day lives. And so rather than continue to diagnose that issue, we wanted to flip the script a little bit and start figuring out, well, what are solutions to that? And so if division is a problem, then connections is potentially a solution. And so we went at this a variety of ways. One of them was wanting to understand how well we know one another. Another was looking at our personal and professional connections. And then we also wanted to look at our social cohesion. How well are we connected to folks, especially folks that were living nearby? With regards to the first one, how well we know one another, the harsh truth that we learned from this year's survey was we really do not know what each other are thinking.
Yeah. So you asked Houstonians about their perceptions of what their neighbors believe. Basically, you were asking, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you were asking liberals what they think conservatives believe, and conservatives what they think liberals believe.
Yeah.
What'd you find out?
Yeah, so we were asking you what you believe, and then we said, okay, based on who you are, what you've told us, your characteristics might be, we're going to ask you about now some other group. And so with thinking about politics, if you said that you were a Democrat, we asked you, what do you think a Republican thinks? If you're a Republican, we asked you what do Democrats think? And so one of the things we found is that sometimes we really do think we're divided on issues. That in fact, when you look at the responses that people actually gave, we're not that divided. And I think one of the clearest examples of that is our attitudes around universal background checks for gun ownership.
And what did you find there?
Yeah, so if I'm a Democrat and I'm being asked, what do I think Republicans? Do Republicans support universal background checks? What percent? I think it's 35%. So about a third of Republicans support universal background checks. If I'm a Republican, I think about 3/4 of Democrats support universal background checks. And so we're signaling we think we are very different on this. And in fact, we think most Republicans oppose this idea. What we found was it's not 3/4 of Democrats that support universal background checks. It's 97% of Democrats support universal background checks, which is a pretty big difference. It is nothing compared to the Republican difference, which is not 35% support, it's 91% support. So not only are we more aligned on this issue, 97% and 91%, we have nearly uniform support for this issue of universal background checks. It is not surprising to believe and to hear and to learn we want policy put into place that protects us and keeps guns out of the hands of criminals. This is not a hard sell, and in fact, it's not a divisive issue at all. It's a unifying issue. We just need to do something about it.
Were there some other examples you found?
Some other examples we found were around issues having to do with morality of different things within life that we have. We looked at contraceptive use. We looked at attitudes towards certain groups within the population. And again, a lot of times what we ended up identifying was we just really don't understand one another. We don't know what the other group is thinking, although we have our assumptions. And so we did this for 9 different questions. And on average, people got 2 questions right, which is essentially tantamount to guessing at random. And so it really does speak to, while sometimes we share out this information, we're not necessarily always registering what it means for another group. Maybe we're taking it more about for ourselves. And so, for us, it's important to make sure that we're connecting our understanding of both ourselves and others, because that gives us the power to be able to take action around some of these issues.
Anything else stand out to you about this year's results that you wanted to highlight?
I mean, I think just the social connections thing in general. We found social connections mattered for our wealth, our health, and our sense of safety. And those are 3 important components of our day-to-day lives. And so when we want to understand why we might be feeling the way we're feeling, why we might be experiencing senses of unsafety, why our economic uncertainty might be there, when we isolate isolate ourselves and when we don't have those connections, it has consequences for us on those many, many different sectors and many, many different dimensions. And so how do we find ways to connect becomes a really important call to action out of this year's report.
Dan Potter is director of the Houston Population Research Center at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. Dan, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, Texas is all in on the development of data centers across the state. What will it mean for the electric grid and for the rest of us? We discuss as Houston Matters continues on News 88.7 and YouTube.
I'm Scott Tong. The United Kingdom.
You count on Houston Public Media. That's why you're here right now. Take the next step and become a new member today. Every gift makes a difference. And with a gift of $5 a month or more, you'll receive PBS Passport, a member benefit that lets you stream more of the shows you love anytime. It only takes a minute to make a big difference. Join as a new member today at houstonpublicmedia.org/donate or call 800-364-8300.
College of Medicine. Baylor's work centers on advancing health and medicine through research, education, and patient care.
Support for Houston Public Media comes from listeners like you and from CertaPro Painters, offering residential and commercial painting services, from color consultations to full project management. Estimates and more at CertaPro.com.
This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. As artificial intelligence and other technological advancements progress, the computing power they require grows. And so we're seeing more and more data centers being built. So far, the state of Texas is welcoming their construction, but with it comes anticipated increases in demand on the state's electric grid. Quite a lot of demand, as a matter of fact, potentially. What does that mean for the rest of us? Let's discuss now with Claire Hao. She's energy and power grid reporter for the Houston Chronicle, and Dr. Harish Sarma Krishnamoorthy, associate professor of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Houston. Welcome to you both.
Yeah, thank you.
Claire, why has Texas become such a prominent location for data center development?
So Texas is already the state with the second most data centers. Virginia is number one. So it's historically already been a hub for data centers, particularly around the Dallas area. And the Dallas area became a hub because it had a lot of fiber optic cables. So a lot of the infrastructure that data centers needed to, be a part of the internet ecosystem. But nowadays, the main reason that data centers are coming to Texas in waves is because we're such an energy-rich state. So data centers, especially the data centers that power AI, need a lot of electricity, and it's getting harder and harder to find that electricity across the country. So it's still faster to connect to the Texas grid than to grids elsewhere, partly because we have our own independent grid. And then for data centers that are, finding that it takes too long for them to connect to the Texas grid, maybe longer than they'd like, they can also stand up their own power generators, whether with, natural gas or, some are trying to look into solar and battery solutions. And so Texas is just adding power generation to our grid too at a rapid clip. And so data centers come here because they think it can accommodate their demand.
Dr. Krishnamoorthy, how much demand are we talking about here?
Oh, that's so recently ERCOT came up with the forecast that by 2032 there will be a 367 gigawatts. So of course it may not reach that levels, but then we are still looking at close to 150 gigawatts of peak demand by 2030 or 2032. So that's a lot, because right now the highest has been about 85.6 gigawatt. That was in summer 2023. So you can imagine there's like a significant growth. So there's an expectation that the power demand will grow by about 2 to 2.1%, but that's way higher than what we have seen in the last couple of decades. So which means that the entire infrastructure, in order to accommodate for all the data centers, will have to grow significantly over the next several years to make sure that everybody gets the desired power that they need at a certain time.
Yeah, Claire, ERCOT's anticipation, their suggestion of this, I guess, fourfold increase in demand in the next 6 years, they initially sort of put that out as well, we think this is what may happen or this could happen. And then there was immediately pushback to it. And now, as I understand it, they're saying, well, we might revise that number. Do we have certainty about how much electricity demand the grid is going to require?
It's really difficult right now to get that kind of certainty on really how much power will data centers coming to Texas need. Nobody really knows. And that's because, ERCOT's forecast is based on information they're getting from transmission distribution utilities. So like CenterPoint, for example, here in the Houston area. And what's happening is a lot of data center developers, they might be submitting multiple applications in Texas, maybe, at different locations or even, across the country, just trying to see like which ones move forward fastest, which ones might get a grid connection fastest, or maybe they, want to build a data center, but for whatever reason, their plans won't pan out. And so you have a lot of speculative projects in ERCOT's waitlist right now. And so it's just making it difficult for ERCOT to determine what is a realistic project that will actually be built, what, there's a gray area, of course, and trying to make any of these like criteria. There's pushback from industry who say we are a real project, but, even if we might not meet one or two of these criteria. And so that's why they put out that forecast that power demand might more than quadruple. I think there's broad industry consensus that that's impossible. It's just there's not enough data center infrastructure in the U.S. to build that many data centers, let alone in Texas. But the hard part is figuring out, so what really is coming.
And I imagine also nobody wants to underreport, come up with a figure, a number, and then suddenly we hit 2030 or 2032, and the demand is larger than whatever that number was that was reported. Now we're in real trouble, right?
Right. I mean, so it's important to get a correct number or, a somewhat accurate number, because if we underestimate demand, that means we haven't built the grid to fully accommodate demand. And so that risks electricity costs skyrocketing, because there's a mismatch of supply and demand, and also even rolling blackouts because the system can't serve all the demand. But also overbuilding the system. So, if all of these data centers that say they want to come here don't come here, and we assume they're all going to come here, and then we way overbuild the grid, that could also lead to issues. Primarily, that means a lot of infrastructure that somebody still has to pay for. So all of our electricity bills, too, could also see an impact there if we overbuild.
Okay, Dr. Krishnamoorthy, this really gets right down to the heart of it, I think, for most of us, which is even if everybody that has a piece in this is accurate in terms of what the demand will ultimately be, and even if the infrastructure is in place and the grid can handle it, what does it mean for us and for our electric bills? How much more could we be paying?
So one of the major issues is, we are already going through a grid transformation. There are multi-fold, let alone AI data centers for now. So one is our grid infrastructure is already aging. I think 50% of all the transmission distribution, the transformers, cables, they are beyond their operational lifetime, right? So they have to be renewed, and so that's on one side. Second, we have hurricanes or wildfires in some locations. So grid has to be modernized for that as well. And the third thing is basically you have variable renewables and others coming in, because economics kind of help with solar panels have reached even cost parity and beyond, right? Like right now. So with all these variations, now you add a variable load on data centers. So I mean there are different elements here. Again, it's very hard to predict. So on one side, the infrastructure that are needed to make our grid more resilient against the conventional natural calamities and the transformation aspects, they eventually will fall on top of consumers like us, right? So we'll see that increase. We are already seeing those increases. So we probably I mean it's very hard to put a number, but it'll probably go maybe almost twice before it comes down. I'm again, this is just my opinion. Yeah. That said, now coming to the AI data center. So the Senate Bill 6, and that's they propose that if a data center requires a certain amount of infrastructure, let them invest for that, right? So first, the Texas State and ERCOT, they are looking at a facility where they can make the data centers pay for that money, for all the infrastructure that they need. On the other hand, there are also these calls for bringing your own grid or bring your own power, BYOG, it's something which is becoming popular, where if you're installing a data center, you rather bring the necessary power by having natural gas generators or energy storage, whatever behind it. So that way, again, it is relatively less likely that we will face the data centers cost a lot on consumers' heads. But that said, there will always be some element which kind of indirectly will come to us.
Claire Hao is an energy and power grid reporter for the Houston Chronicle. Dr. Harish Sarma Krishnamoorthy is an associate professor of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Houston. Thank you both very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for having us here.
And just ahead, navigating the new and complicated world of compensating college athletes. Why it's a challenge for universities as well as for the athletes and their families. Stay with us as Houston Matters continues on News 88.7 and YouTube.
Support.
It's not just your car. It's the one that brought your kids home from school, took you cross-country, held memories, laughter, even a few breakdowns. When it's time to let go, give your car a new purpose. Donate it and turn memories into meaningful support for this station. Plus, you'll enjoy free and easy pickup, potential tax benefits, and a simple donation process. Your gift supports the programs you and your family love. Donate today and help keep public media strong. Call or donate online.
For emerging writers at the University of Houston, featuring poet and professor Cicely Parks, May 18th through the 22nd. Early bird registration at boldfaceconference.com.
Tonight on Houston Public Media TV 8 at 7, Finding Your Roots welcomes actress Rebecca Hall and director Lee Daniels. Then at 8, it's episode 4 of Ken Burns' The American Revolution. Tonight on TV 8.
This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. Houston is home to thousands of student athletes at the University of Houston, at Rice, Texas Southern, Prairie View A&M, and more. And many of these athletes are navigating a new world of compensation directly from the universities themselves and indirectly through what are called name, image, and likeness agreements, or NILs, agreed to with local businesses. But just how much athletes are making school to school, team to team, or player to player is really just about anybody's guess. While how much any one university can pay athletes in total is capped, that's about it when it comes to the numbers. Houston Public Media's Dominic Anthony Walsh recently dug into this. I spoke with him about it on Monday afternoon.
So there are two categories of payments that I looked into. Revenue sharing, which is the kind of new payments allowed under the House settlement from last year that's been talked about widely. This allows sports programs to pay part of their revenue directly to college athletes. The other category, name, image, and likeness payments, typically paid by third parties, but reported in a way that the universities are aware of how much their student athletes are making. Now, under state law, name, image, and likeness payments are confidential on an individual athlete level, but potentially, it's not confidential at an aggregate level, so how much per team are athletes making? Similarly, with the revenue sharing, there's an argument that on an individual level, because of FERPA at the federal level, they're confidential, but, on an aggregate team level, potentially they could be public. So I asked for both of these payments, both on an individual and an aggregate level, across, per team, per player, and what did I get back? A lot of nothing. Essentially. So the one school that did disclose something to me was UT Austin. As of the time that we had reported this story, they had handed out $13.5 million in revenue sharing payments to their student athletes from July 2025 through March 2026. And that put them on track to hit the $20.5 million cap per year. After the story came out, interestingly, I did get some records back from the University of Texas at El Paso. And, I mentioned that $20.5 million cap. A program like UT Austin, really big, lots of revenue, they're going to hit the cap. UTEP over in El Paso, They, as of my request, had only paid out $1.4 million in revenue sharing to student athletes. And that is exactly what I was interested in exploring, kind of the gap between the powerhouses and the smaller players and what that means for competition. But like I said, it's really difficult to get real insight into how much student athletes are making.
I understand from the individual perspective when it comes to name, image, and likeness. Clearly, even if you requested it, there's no reason that they would give that, and it seems they are absolutely right to keep that confidential. But when it comes to those aggregate numbers, why is it that nearly every university you asked was basically ignoring your request?
Well, first, I want to push back against the idea that even on an individual level, revenue sharing and NIL deals should be confidential. Under state law, NIL on an individual level is confidential, but revenue share is not mentioned in state law. Public universities point to the Family Education Rights Privacy Act, FERPA, as a reason to withhold that information. But, during my reporting, I did chat with a investigative enterprise reporter for Sportico, Daniel Libet. He covers college sports and believes in transparency in college sports. He points out that if you want to know how much a coach or a sports administrator makes from these public universities, you can find that out. And for example, we looked into that. When I asked UH how much the big revenue sports, how much those coaches make, we know that Willie Fritz makes $4.5 million per year for the football team. Kelvin Sampson makes $6 million per year for the basketball team, and Matthew Mitchell with the women's basketball team makes $600,000. So there is kind of this open question about whether the same level of confidentiality, why student athletes get a higher level of confidentiality for payments they're getting from public coffers compared to these coaches. Now, when it comes to the second part of your question, the aggregate level, this is something that it'll be interesting to see how the Attorney General rules on. In Texas, when there are disputes or uncertainty about what is and is not subject to public disclosure under the state's public information law, the Attorney General kind of referees that dispute. And right now, a lot of these requests that we submitted are still before the Attorney General, including the stuff looking for this information on a per team level. And so it will be interesting to see. I have no doubt that they will rule out the individual payments, even setting aside the argument about whether or not that should be public or confidential. Under state law and FERPA, I think that this is a special category that'll be protected. But when it comes to the aggregate stuff, that'll be interesting.
To some, there is a clear distinction here between making public what a coach gets paid as a public employee, a full-time employee, and what a player, an enrolled student, does. Why is it important to know what a given student athlete may be paid through whatever means?
So that distinction is actually why under federal law, it seems like those students would likely be protected, those student athletes, because, for example, under a federal work-study program, when your compensation is directly tied to your status as a student, that tends to be confidential. Now, the reason that there's this argument that you hear from folks like Daniel Libet and others, also I should mention over in Louisiana, a collection of outlets are suing Louisiana State University for these types of records on an individual level. The reason they're making these arguments is because there's a lot of money here and it's public money, right? And so when generally under the Texas Public Information Act, the way public money is spent is subject to public scrutiny. It's kind of like foundational to that law. And so there's a real, discourse happening here around the privacy of individual students, which is what is protected under federal law, versus the rights of the public to know how their money is being spent, which is, the foundation and the purpose of the Texas Public Information Act. So there really are kind of two forces tugging and pulling here.
That whole debate aside, how is this new world of compensating college athletes impacting college sports?
Well, I chatted with Tommy McClelland, the vice president and director of athletics over at Rice University, and he had an interesting perspective. He talked about his time as a student athlete years ago, And at the time, coaches couldn't even give student athletes a ride from one end of the campus to another while it was raining. That was viewed as an impermissible benefit. So he says, obviously, that was not a good or reasonable system. Now, with this transition to compensation of student athletes, there is this idea that they're not being taken advantage of as much as they used to be. The revenue that they're helping to generate, they are now getting a piece of. But, the different kind of financial status of these various universities means that there is then a question about, competitiveness. There are lots of kind of small private schools like Rice across the state. And when I chatted with the state lawmaker who actually wrote one of the laws allowing for revenue sharing, he expressed concerns about some of those smaller schools. This is Representative Tepper, a Lubbock lawmaker who in 2025 authored the state's student-athlete compensation law. He specifically said he thinks that they're in danger of losing a lot of Division I schools like Hardin-Simmons, McMurray University, even Baylor, Southern Methodist universities. I pointed out UT Austin, they're going to hit that salary cap, the $20.5 million revenue sharing cap. Now, are these smaller universities going to be able to do the same thing? So there are real questions, especially with the nature of the transfer portal, where people can switch teams almost on an unlimited basis.
So this is not just a question of recruiting, which is always hyper-competitive, and larger programs have always had a clear advantage there. But you're also talking about retaining college athletes, that somebody plays one season for you and they're gone.
I mentioned Representative Carl Tepper, who authored the state's revenue sharing bill for student athletes. He pointed out that in 2025, President Donald Trump issued an executive order on this topic. Trump described an out-of-control, rudderless system in which competing university donors engage in bidding wars for the best players who can change teams each season. And so, Tepper and Trump seem to agree, as do a lot of other people, that something needs to change. And so one of the proposals is to put a cap on how many times you can actually enter the transfer portal and switch teams, to kind of reduce the turmoil and, within the college athletics scene and how often people are bouncing from team to team. A lot of ideas about how to overcome this hurdle to competition that's posed by revenue sharing.
For the student athletes themselves, how complicated has this world become to navigate?
Well, part of the issue, both for individual student athletes and for coaches and administrators, is there's a lot of murkiness here. You don't really know how much, individuals are making or how much teams are spending. So, that goes back to this transparency question earlier. There is this balance between the privacy of individual athletes and the ability of teams to be competitive and keep information close to their chest versus the murkiness and the lack of transparency, which then leads to folks not really knowing what they should be asking for, what they should be offering to their athletes. So both from an individual athlete perspective and from an administrator and coach perspective, there are some obstacles that are posed by this lack of transparency.
Aside from floating the idea of limiting the number of times a student athlete can transfer schools, have there been any steps taken to try and establish clearer guidelines surrounding college athlete compensation?
There have been conversations about it. In my reporting, I didn't hear about any concrete steps aside from President Donald Trump's executive order that he issued. In that executive order, he wrote that opportunities for scholarships and collegiate athletic competition in women's and non-revenue sports must be preserved and, where possible, expanded. And he directed the Department of Labor to take action to maximize the educational benefits and opportunities provided by higher education institutions through athletics. Now, all that said, this conversation is definitely not over. There have been, proposals for new legislation both at the federal level and potentially at the state level. So we likely will see this conversation continue.
That's Houston Public Media's Dominic Anthony Walsh. We spoke Monday afternoon. Joining us now is Kamisha Mickey, a Houston-based attorney and the founder of Mickey Law Group, which works directly with student athletes and their families to help them understand contracts, protect their eligibility, and think about long-term financial decisions. Kamisha, good morning.
Good morning.
What is the biggest misunderstanding that you're coming across from athletes and their families when it comes to all of this?
I think a lot of students, because they're students, their job is to go to school and play their sport. They're student athletes. You're a business now, and you have to treat it as such. So the people that have the understanding of that and approach it in that manner tend to do a bit better than those that don't.
Houston has a large number of college programs and a strong local business community, of course. How would you describe the NIL landscape here compared to other big cities?
What I've seen in Houston is more collective NIL deals, like more team deals, team-based. It seems that the companies here normally have a deal or promotions using the entire team, like the U of H basketball team, as opposed to individual athletes. And I know there are some that do have these deals, but it just seems here in Houston it's more of a collective as opposed to an individual deals.
A lot of athletes may think what they ought to do is chase national brands. I guess do you agree with that, or do you think no, they're better off working out agreements with local businesses, particularly if it's like the whole team kind of doing that?
I think that is a very individual decision to make. I think there are pros and cons to both. If you're from a city, of course, that would make it a bit easier to say I'm going to be more ingrained in my city as opposed to just national brands. You know the local businesses, you seek out those businesses, you make deals with them. You become more ingrained in the community. The people know you. They've probably known you from playing, high school ball here and followed you through college. And whenever you leave here, you've built such a following, they will still follow you. They will be your fans. They will, whatever brand you're promoting at that time, they will look at those brands. Some students that are not originally from a city per se, and they go to that city, yes, national brands may be more their thing because they don't have any particular, I don't have any particular love for just being in this one spot. I'm okay to go anywhere. I don't have any concrete roots in this place.
I imagine some students and families may be faced with contracts with certain terms or certain specifics. Are there mistakes that people are making as they enter into agreements if they don't have guidance about, this could create trouble down the road and here's why?
Yes, definitely. Reason being, the rules are different based on schools. Rules are different in different states. And the NCAA doesn't have any blanket per se rules. There's just a couple that you have to follow. Most students, what I tell parents to look for is, number one, exclusivity deals, because making a deal with this one company or this one product, that will affect you if they say you can only do it with this, you can't do any similar or like products for this company. Okay, well, if if you think your kid's going to make the jump into some national campaign for potentially a like or similar product, you probably don't want to make that deal. And the amount of time on the deals, I know some schools now are putting clauses in contracts where it's if you jump, you'll have to pay this amount of money back.
Oh, if you change schools?
Yes, if you change schools. And so those are now in the NIL because they're trying to keep students. There are a lot, the portal, people are leaving. So it's things like that. Look for exclusivity, look how long is the time, and look for termination clauses because, what happens if the student does not do X, Y, and Z? What if it's, something out of their control? What will be the repercussions of those things?
You mentioned that different states have different rules surrounding all of this. What are maybe rules or a couple, I don't know, here in Texas that athletes ought to know about that might be very different if they try to transfer to a school in another state?
The main thing, especially for, let's just go to high school students. Some states allow high school students at the end of their high school careers, juniors, seniors, that age, they can do or start making NIL deals. They can start talking about
even
it. They
before
can start,
college.
Even before college, you know where you're going to go. Texas does not. You have to be at least 17 years old, and you have to have exhausted, your playing years. Because if not, you could affect your amateur status, and you don't want that to happen. So going from one state to another, one state that allows a kid to do that and one state that doesn't, what's my eligibility now? What can I do because I've done this thing?
Does this mean you could agree to a deal as, a 16 or 17-year-old, and it turns out you're no longer eligible to play in college? Is that what that means?
Sometimes. Your amateur status not necessarily not play in college, but you can't play in high school anymore. Like I've got another year left.
Yeah.
And now I've done, something to now I'm no longer an amateur. Like now I have to make the jump. I can't stay here and play anymore.
Okay. What is one thing you wish every athlete in the city of Houston who may at some point down the road have the opportunity to make one of these deals understand before they sign a contract?
The one thing I wish everyone would look at is the long-term consequences of the deals that they make. It's exciting. It's a new area. It's only been a few years since players have been able to be paid, for the contributions on the field. But my main thing for my clients, what I'm trying to do is, okay, let's look at this deal. What is your end goal? Are you staying at this school, or do you plan to leave this school at some point? Are you open to that? How can we structure something so that if all of this goes away, you will still have your finances will be okay? Because a lot of people just look at it as right now, this is great, this is exciting, let me sign, let me get this check. Nobody looks at what happens long term, what happens down the road if you were to get injured, or if there is another school that you would like to go to. Now what?
Kamisha Mickey is the founder of Mickey Law Group. Kamisha, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
And still to come, violinist Joshua Bell. He's performing here in Houston early next month. Stay with us as Houston Matters continues on News 88.7 and YouTube.
We know you value Houston Public Media. That's why you're watching right now. So take the next step and become a new member of the station you rely on. Every gift makes a difference. And what matters most right now is supporting the station that brings you the news and information you rely on. It only takes a minute to make a big difference. So join as a new member today at houstonpublicmedia.org/donate or call 800-364-8300.
For Houston Public Media comes from electricityplans.com, helping Houstonians find electricity plans based on home energy usage and rate comparisons. Enrollment details and more at electricityplans.com.
Support comes from Energy Fest, a community festival in Houston's Energy Corridor. Open to the public May 2nd from 3 to 7 p.m. at Addicts Park and Ride. Live music, local vendors, food trucks, and family activities. Details at energyfest.org.
Grammy Award-winning violinist Joshua Bell will be in town May 7th, 9th, and 10th performing with the Houston Symphony. The concert will include works he commissioned from 5 celebrated modern composers. The piece is called The Elements. He told our Joshua was in about it in 2022 when Bell was just beginning the project. First, though, Bell talks about how the classical world has been modernizing.
It's a little less stiff as far as like dress wear. I think a lot of artists are not feeling compelled to wear white tie and tails, which is what when I've started my career, everybody wore that, and it was very, very formal in that way. And I think that's a good thing because classical music itself, I think, suffers from a bit of a stigma of it being very formal and may scare some people away that maybe they're not wearing the right thing or clapping at the wrong times. And that's something I'm always hoping to try to dispel in any way possible. That's one thing that I feel has changed. But I think on a more deeper level, I think certainly in the last few years, we've been a lot more inclusive in finding repertoire from underrepresented segments of the population. There's a big push now to find and discover some amazing works that have been neglected from the African American community. There are a lot more female conductors for once. When I was growing up, I think it took 20 years before I worked with a female conductor, and now I'd say it's getting close to 50-50 now, and that's a great thing. And I think I think in composition there's been a big difference. I think the music lately has written by modern composers is still innovative, but yet it's somehow more. To put it bluntly, more listenable. I think composers are not afraid to write melody anymore. I think there was a time period where you were kind of frowned upon if you were a composer writing something that was sounded too tonal. So I think those are some changes, and but in general, I'm very optimistic about the state of classical music. I know people have predicted this downfall or for centuries now, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're doing just fine. I think going forward, I'm very optimistic.
Throughout your career, obviously, you've traveled quite a bit and you've performed in a number of cities, a number of countries. I am curious, though, outside of the performances in the different places you go, are there things you look for, unique experiences you look for when you travel to a new city or to a new country, or when you come back to a city like Houston or wherever you've been before?
I think I'm suited for this lifestyle. Not everybody would be. Some people look at my schedule and say, I don't know why or how you do this. I've been doing it since I was 14, and I just love the traveling. And of course, it's the music making number one, because it's my favorite thing to do anyway, and it's my job. But the experiences of visiting, other cultures, particularly food, of course, like most artists, I'm a foodie, and enjoy the going to these different countries and different places, or even different cities like Houston. I'm planning on trying to get some good Tex-Mex and maybe some good barbecue while I'm there.
Excellent, excellent.
Which is, each place I go, I have restaurants that I've built up over the years, places I look forward to going to, even a Papacitos maybe at the if it's open late after one of the concerts. I got to check that.
I am curious, are there contemporary composers or contemporary violin pieces that you are particularly fond of, or pieces that you've played recently that you've kind of taken a particular enjoyment to?
Well, there's, I'll give an example of something I just heard very recently, so it's fresh in my mind. I have some very good friends that are in a group called Time for Three, Charles Yang and Nick Kendall and Renan, the bass player. It's two violins and a bass, and they're incredible. And they had a commission from a composer, Kevin Putz, and he wrote this incredible concerto for them. That's part bluegrass, part jazz, but yet incredibly complex classical piece. I was blown away by that, and it just so happens that I've commissioned Kevin Putz to write something for me next year. In fact, I've commissioned 5 composers to write me each to write me a 7 or 8 minute piece that I'm going to put together as a suite called The Elements. So it's a big project that I'm very very excited about. Jesse Montgomery and Edgar Meyer and Jake Heggie and Jennifer Higdon and Kevin Putz. So these are all American composers that I'm very excited about, and and they agreed to do this piece that can be played each separately or as a suite called The Elements. So this is something coming up that I'm totally psyched about.
Yeah, that's a great list of names. It's a really impressive roster of composers there. Just kind of wrapping up, when you approach a new piece like what they're writing for you, do you approach that differently compared to, like, say, the Sibelius Concerto, which has tradition, which has previous performances?
Yeah, well, certainly, yeah, the pieces like Sibelius, before I learned it, although I was 14 years old when I started playing it, I already had heard it many, many times by many people and had certain ideas in my head, and I could listen to recordings and get an idea. There's something amazing about having something fresh written for you that with no track record, there's the opportunity to work with the composer because they're still alive and suggest things, which is something I love doing. I mean, I got to work with John Corigliano, one of my favorite composers, who wrote the Red Violin film score and violin concerto for me, and that was just a formative experience. And so there's that aspect of getting to work with the composers and also just put your stamp on something that has never been. It's like exploring uncharted territory, and it's very exciting to do that.
That's violinist Joshua Bell talking with our Joshua Zinn in 2022. Bell is indeed performing The Elements, the work he commissioned from those 5 modern composers in a concert with the Houston Symphony on May 7th, 9th, and 10th. And that'll do it for today's show. The Houston Matters team includes Michael Haggerty, Joshua Zinn, Brenda Valdivia, Mincho Jacob, and Laura Walker. Jared Carroll's our technical director. On tomorrow's show, we discuss developments in politics in our regular Wednesday political roundup. Also, ahead of a conference on college athletics and mental health, we discuss sports and mental health with Dr. Emmett Gill Jr. He is Director of Mental Health Services at the University of Houston. Plus, we meet a couple of the folks behind Ice House Radio, an online community radio station dedicated to broadcasting and archiving Southern music culture. I'm Craig Cohen. Join us tomorrow for those and other Houston Matters.
On the next Fresh Air, Flea. After recording many albums with the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Flea has his first solo album. We'll talk about being afraid to go home when he was young, how the Chili Peppers tried to be the wildest